I wrote a blog post many years ago entitled The Problem with Being Right. The impetus for the piece was my recalling a meeting I had with a CEO I was working with, where I was trying yet again to persuade him to agree to two fairly radical recommendations I had been advocating for. We had a board meeting coming up in a few days, and this was my last chance to get him to agree. I had stayed up most of the night reworking my board PowerPoint deck and asked to see him in private to review it. I sat down in his office and rather aggressively took him through all the customer and competitive insights we had assembled. I tried to dazzle with keen observations, lots of what I saw as insightful findings, and of course, plenty of data and what I believe was impeccable logic. I ended with a flourish, saying that without presenting these to the board later that week and getting their support, big problems would soon emerge for the company. He paused and sat back in his big leather chair. He let out a small sigh. "You know, Steve," he began, "I think I've figured out why we aren't on the same page with this thing." I leaned forward, sensing a possible softening in his position. "Go on," I thought to myself. "You keep telling me I have a problem, and I don't think I do."
Welcome to a special Remarkable Retail Podcast summer series focused on what leaders need to do to help their organizations win the future and leap to higher ground. I'm Michael LeBlanc, and in this 6-part limited series, Steve will be unpacking key lessons from his new best-selling book, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, available everywhere books are sold.
It's me. Hi, I'm Steve Dennis, and you're listening to Episode 3 of our special 6-part summer series of the Remarkable Retail Podcast. Author Steven Pressfield puts it plainly: there is an enemy. That enemy is you. I've come to believe that meaningful transformations, be they personal or far more corporate, require 4 major things: a rigorous and honest examination of the current situation, willingness to accept how things really and truly are, no matter how challenging, the desire and the ability to create a bold change plan, and the courage to act on that plan. In many respects, this all seems quite simple and clear. Yet, as we talked about in our first episode, successful transformations often don't happen because we don't aim high enough, nor do we move fast enough. The reasons for this, of course, are many, but the most foundational one is often how our egos keep us stuck. In my new book, Leaders Leap, I propose a series of 7 mind leaps that are essential to transforming you and your organization. And by mind leap, I mean a profound shift in the way many leaders typically think or behave in a critically important area. There is a powerful reason that crush your ego is mind leap number 1. Without starting from a place of humility, our foundation will be shaky, and we cannot build a house of sustained innovation and transformation without rock-solid first principles. Indeed, we must put our mask on first. This mind leap may also be the most difficult of the 7 because it requires that we take a hard look at ourselves, to admit we might be a big part of whatever problems we're encountering. It demands that we let go of tired beliefs, blind spots, defense mechanisms, confirmation biases, our imposter syndrome, and our deepest fears that no longer serve the journey we are about to embark upon. It insists that we open up in ways we may not have done before and become willing to fail. That can be terrifying, and yet it's our only choice if we wish to make bold progress. But if you are anything like me, you've likely been conditioned to believe that through sheer focus, maybe the right education, lots of hard work and fierce determination, you can accomplish just about anything, that you can be a nearly omnipotent master of your own domain. Be productive, stay focused, never let them see you sweat. Don't let too much space exist between you and your job. Plan the work the plan, rinse and repeat. But I'm going to argue that while it is understandable to believe that successful transformations and our own personal success are often hindered by things like poor analysis or cultural barriers, not enough innovative ideas, a lack of appropriate resources, poor board or management support, extreme pressure to meet quarterly earnings, etc., 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 it is very often the case that progress is impeded by that person we see in the mirror each day and our unhealthy attachment to ego. Stoic philosopher Ryan Holiday lays this out perfectly in his best-selling book, Ego is the Enemy. He writes, "Many of us insist the main impediment to a full, successful life is the outside world. In fact, the most common enemy lies within our ego. Earlier in our career, it impedes learning and the cultivation of talent. With success, it can blind us to our faults and sow future problems. In failure, it magnifies each blow and makes recovery more difficult. At every stage, ego holds us back." It's become my experience that we can see much of this in ourselves and others rather easily if we are willing to pay close attention. If we look outward, we can see many famous leaders who suffer from what I like to call executive ego dysfunction. It's a close cousin of narcissistic personality disorder, but doesn't require a clinical diagnosis. We pretty much know it when we see it or experience it in a leader. An exaggerated sense of their knowledge and insight, a need to always be the center of attention, an unwillingness to ask for help, and so on. They weigh in with great confidence on topics they know really nothing about. They make statements like, "I alone can fix it," or are shameless in their relentless self-promotion and impervious to any kind of criticism. Anything bad that happens to them is always somebody else's fault. They can never take responsibility, and their victim anger is often embarrassingly on display as they lash out. I bet you can rather easily think of a few high-profile leaders who fit this description. But all too often we ignore their dysfunction because of their presumed genius, outsized financial results, huge social media following, or overall celebrity. To tolerate or minimize this behavior is, however, a big mistake. But enough about them. Let's lean into a bit of irony and talk about me. Like me, you may have been taught at an early age that self-sufficiency was a virtue. If you went, as I did, to a famous school and upon graduation joined a prestigious company, you got the sense that you were, how should I phrase this exactly? I think I'll go with pretty hot shit. My desire to move up the corporate ladder and my hunger for attention, admiration, and affirmation only grew stronger as I grasped for grandiose titles and more money. As I got those bigger and bigger jobs, the notion that I was the supreme source of power and wisdom, the main man, the head honcho, the grand poobah, was constantly reinforced. My subordinates often hung on my every word, or so it seemed, or they worked hard to figure out just what it was that the boss wanted. I'm also quite certain I was guilty of more mansplaining than anyone should be subjected to. As time went on, I found myself in more and more of the rooms where it happened. Strategic planning discussions and large allocations of capital, annual budget reviews, presentations to the board of directors of companies worth many billions of dollars. Important people seemed to listen to what I had to say. They trusted me with huge sums of money and the oversight of many hundreds of people. And the money, as well as the promotions, just kept coming. I also seemed to have an almost pathological draw to difficult situations and nearly impossible challenges. Have a business that needs to be turned around? Hey, I'll do it. Need to jumpstart a moribund division that's lost its way? Ooh, pick me, pick me. Want to energize the growth potential of an ill-advised acquisition? Baby, I'm your man. After a while, you began to believe your own press. I know I did. Of course, it's not just me. We've made godlike figures out of CEOs, founding entrepreneurs, and other leaders whom we treat like rock stars, and all too often the results are not pretty. Regardless, the fact is, as leaders, much of our compensation, both monetary and psychological, comes in some way, shape, or form from being right. But as I teased at the top of this show, there's a problem with being right. When we are convinced that we are right, We often grasp far too tightly to getting our way, becoming overly attached to the outcome. I used to joke that I was always one more iteration of a PowerPoint deck away from persuading anybody of anything. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but honestly, not by much. Which brings me back to the story I started with today, where I tried to persuade the CEO who I was working with to admit I had cleverly figured out our only way forward. Looking back on it many years later, I see clearly that it was both our egos that kept us stuck in an unproductive dance. We epitomized Dennis Sparks' quote that the world is divided into people who think they are right. In Liam Neeson-like fashion, the CEO kept reverting to his very particular set of skills.
If you're looking for ransom, I can tell you I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
That approach had served him well for quite some time. But it also made it impossible for him to see how the strategy that had brought him fame and fortune was running out of gas, as would become painfully obvious just a few years later. He was trapped in expert mind, rather than heeding the wise words of Shunryu Suzuki that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. For my part, I had a very particular analytical hammer that I used to pound the same nails over and over. I was right, and I was not about to let anyone tell me otherwise. And if I could not convince you of my problem-solving superiority, then I was a failure. Anyway, if you're wondering how this battle of egos ended, the answer is quite poorly. I ended up unemployed and hospitalized, which you might guess wasn't exactly what I was going for. The CEO fared a bit better for a while, but because he didn't change course, he eventually got the boot, and the value of the company took a dive from which it has never really fully recovered. As Lao Tzu says, if you don't change directions, you might end up where you are headed. Of course, as leaders, many of us are taught to be confident, to exude certainty, to never let them see us sweat. Any wavering is seen as weakness. In an uncertain world, it is not surprising, therefore, that we often seek the safety of knowing something for sure. But mostly, that is a trap our ego beckons us into. Absolute certainty simply does not exist, and lack of it is neither good nor bad. Uncertainty is neutral. In fact, in a world that is changing ever faster, too much certainty can be hazardous indeed. There is often great wisdom to be discovered with a willing embrace of uncertainty. Embracing uncertainty creates a sense of wonder, of discernment, of curiosity, all incredibly valuable skills for driving creativity and seeing a wider range of options and actions. Consider all the beliefs that the auto industry held onto that kept them from embracing electric vehicles far earlier, or those in the taxi industry who mostly sat around and watched Uber and Lyft transform their industry, or the management of Blockbuster who believed they were in the store-based video rental business rather than the home entertainment solutions business, or the folks at BlackBerry who hung on to the idea that a mobile phone must have a keyboard while the iPhone revolutionized the ways we communicate. In his brilliant book, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, best-selling author and Wharton professor Adam Grant stresses the importance of intellectual humility, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge our own beliefs to become more successful in navigating the future. He points to 3 things we cling to at the expense of being open to possibilities that may in fact serve us better. Grant emphasizes the need to question our assumptions and be open to changing our beliefs when new evidence or perspectives emerge. He argues that many of our assumptions are based on outdated information or biases, and by challenging them, we can discover new insights and make better decisions. He also encourages us to be cautious on relying too heavily on our instincts or gut feeling. Although instincts can be valuable in certain situations, they can also lead us astray, particularly when faced with complex or unfamiliar problems. Lastly, Grant suggests that our habits can sometimes hinder our ability to think critically and adapt to new information. He advocates for a mindset of continuous learning and growth, which involves being open to feedback, actively seeking out new perspectives, and being willing to unlearn and relearn. Another well-known person, billionaire Warren Buffett, also reminds us not to ignore the role blind luck plays in our good fortunes, specifically the time, place, and conditions under which we were born. But lots of us seem to act as if literally everything good that's ever happened to us is completely a function of our hard work, resilience, genius, and devastatingly charming personality. Related to this notion, of course, is the saying, some people are born on third base and go through life thinking they hit a triple. So far, as keys to crushing our ego, we've talked about the need to get humble, to embrace uncertainty, to be willing to unlearn and relearn, to acknowledge the role of luck in our success. Now let's talk about one more important dimension, vulnerability. Until quite recently, vulnerability was not a word that got used very much when it came to desirable leadership qualities. There are, of course, many definitions of vulnerability. For me, it has come to mean having the emotional courage to expose myself and to be seen for who I really am and what is really going on with me. In every place I have ever worked, being vulnerable was not discussed. It was tacitly and often overtly discouraged. I was taught from an early age not to show my emotions and mostly to figure out things for myself. In my corporate experience, the messages were work hard, suck it up, and keep your personal stuff to yourself. But it's clearly not just where I happen to work. We are surrounded by messages that to be vulnerable is to be weak. I cannot possibly do justice to this topic in a couple of minutes. For a far deeper dive, I would point you to Brené Brown's amazing work on this subject and more broadly on the topic of courageous leadership. As Brené says, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. I could not agree more. As we move toward our close, I'd like to share a favorite quotation from another of my favorite writers, Anne Lamott. She writes, "My mind is like a bad neighborhood. Nobody should go in there alone." For me, that's a great reminder that even if we come to accept that we are often at the center of our problems, that doesn't mean that crushing our egos and making the progress we must is a lonely solo project. Getting humble, becoming vulnerable also means being willing to ask for help. It's taken me far longer than I would have liked to finally see this, but it's made all the difference in the world. Just two more quotes quickly before we move to our questions of the week. The first is from Viktor Frankl. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And from Kendrick Lamar, sit down, be humble. Next week, we'll be back to explore what it takes to fully wake up to new realities, to do the hard, uncomfortable work of bold transformation, and how to open the aperture to identify new growth possibilities. But right now, let's wrap up with a few questions to bring some of this episode's material to life and to help you think about how to apply these concepts to your own organization and its unique situation. Question 1. Where are you sometimes your own worst enemy? What are some ways to rethink your approach? Number 2. What are 3 critical assumptions or hypotheses you hold dear about the long-term strength of your business model or your brand differentiation and relevance that might be worth challenging? 3. What would adopting a regular practice of beginner's mind look like for you and your organization? And lastly, number 4, what benefits might embracing vulnerability with your team or your network possibly unlock? I hope you'll discuss these with your teams and see what insights unfold. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to a special Summer Leaders Leap bonus edition of the Remarkable Retail Podcast, hosted by Steve Dennis and produced by me, Michael LeBlanc. Season 9 of the Remarkable Retail Podcast returns in its usual format on September 10th. Follow us wherever you enjoy your podcast, and don't forget to drop us that 5-star review. Safe travels, everyone.